I'm Gary Kechanowski, President and Vice Chancellor of Memorial University, and it is indeed my pleasure to welcome you all to our St. John's campus and to our first Royal Society of Canada New Fellow Public Lecture. The Royal Society of Canada is the senior national body of distinguished Canadian scholars, artists, and scientists, and the oldest association of scientists and scholars in Canada. And since the early 1970s, 27 distinguished faculty from Memorial have received the prestigious honor of being named a Fellow of the Royal Society of Canada. It is a national honor and a tremendous accomplishment to be selected by your peers as a Royal Society Fellow. And recently, 3 outstanding researchers from Memorial have been named as new Fellows of the Royal Society, and I'm speaking of Dr. Carole Peterson, University Research Professor in the Department of Psychology, Faculty of Science, will be speaking to us this evening. Dr. Peter Pope, University Research Professor in the Department of Archaeology, the Faculty of Arts, and Dr. Barbara Neese, University Research Professor in the Department of Sociology, Faculty of Arts. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in congratulating our newest fellows. Thank you. A university distinguishes itself by the collective actions, accomplishments, and success of its people, of its faculty, its staff, students and alumni, by what they all do as active and engaged citizens to make the world a better place to live, safer, more prosperous, more sustainable, and more interesting. And of course, here at Memorial, we strive to have a national and global impact while ensuring that we fulfill our special obligations to the people of this great province. And it is the impact of the scholarship and research of people like our Royal Society Fellows that is helping us achieve our vision, a vision to be one of the most distinguished public universities in Canada and beyond. And tonight, we have the pleasure of learning a little more about the work being conducted by one of these outstanding researchers and leaders, Dr. Peterson. And to introduce Dr. Peterson, I will now call upon Dr. Graham Bell, President of the Royal Society of Canada. Dr. Bell is James McGill Professor and Chair of the Biology Department at McGill University. He has previously served the Royal Society as the President of the Academy of Science and assumed the presidency of the Society just a few days ago. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Bell to our campus and to our wonderful city and province. Dr. Bell.
It's a pleasure to introduce Dr. Carole Peterson this evening. I think that she exemplifies one of the main features of the Royal Society of Canada, which is almost unique among the major national academies of the world, and that is the breadth of what is done there. If you look at our sister organizations like the National Academy of Sciences in the United States or the Royal Society of London in Britain, these tend to be very much academies of science. The Royal Society of Canada was founded on a sort of dual model of the London Royal Society and l'Institut de France, which encompasses not only their science academies, but also the Académie Française and a number of other groups which are not strictly scientific at all. So from its inception, the Royal Society has encompassed the arts and humanities, the social sciences, the natural sciences, in short, the whole breadth of, well, as nearly as possible, the whole breadth of intellectual endeavor within the country. So it's a great pleasure that I look forward to Dr. Carole Peterson's talk on what is surely a very interdisciplinary sort of subject. The preliteracy, oral skills, and eyewitness memory in children is a scientific issue, it's a sociological issue, it's a legal issue. It's an issue which brings together all of those different strands. So as an exemplar of the Royal Society, I can hardly think of someone better placed than Dr. Carole Peterson.
Thank you very much. What I'm going to do today is give you an overview of what is totally 3.5 decades of research that I've been involved in. And what I want to emphasize overall is, first of all, serendipity. That's played a big role in terms of what's happened, and also curiosity or intellectually driven research has been an important mantra for what's been happening, and sharp turns along the way. I've reinvented myself in different ways for different things. In other words, what I want to emphasize is the fact that you really cannot predict where a research program is going to go when you start out, and you can't predict what kind of benefits you're going to get. You just don't know. I'm a developmental psychologist. That means I study children, and in particular what I study is children's cognition, their thinking, their language, their memory. So, example, the kinds of things that I study, here, children. And where we start is with serendipity, analyzing narratives. When I was a graduate student, I just happened to read this article on conference proceedings. So it wasn't in the regular literature. I don't remember how I got hold of these conference proceedings. But this particular article was by William Leboff and one of his students, Joshua Waletsky. And what they were looking at, what they were talking about is narrative analysis. By narratives, what they meant is stories about one's life, stories about one's adventures, and they were focused on autobiographical stories. So when I talk about narrative, what I'm talking about is autobiographical stories. What's happened to me? What are the adventures that I've had in my life? Now, this particular paper was enormously influential. And it founded huge new areas of research. Enormous number of people got into the area of narrative analysis because of this paper. And what he was saying is he developed this notion of a well-structured narrative, this personal story. And this is this graph here shows what this well-structured narrative is supposed to look like. That, first of all, we enter, here's where we enter it, and it's the abstract kind of a little précis about, oh, I'm going to tell you about a time when, kind of thing. And then you have, this is the orientation where you give the background, who, what, when, where, you know, it's kind of like the context, the background. Then we get into the nuts and bolts of what actually happened. Okay? And that's what he called the complicating action. Complicating action, the critical thing that he outlined is what I have circled here with the big E, and that is the evaluation. So what? That's where a person, that he saw a narrative as building to some major crisis, some major point, something that made you think, oh, now I understand what's important about this. Now I understand why you told me. This is why you don't sit there and think, ho-hum, so why did they bother telling me this? This is really the meat of it. This is their emotion, their feeling. He says that was a critical part. Now, after this high point, it became what's called the high point analysis, then what you had is the resolution, where essentially you said, okay, then what happened to, you know, solve that problem? And then the coda is, and brings it up to date. That's what happens up to, you know, up to now. Okay? So the coda is the ending. Now, what Leboff said is that children under 15 simply could not structure narratives. They absolutely couldn't do it. Sorry, no, you know, they were unable to do it. And you really didn't have any of this kind of nice, pretty, and coherent structure until they got to be almost adults. Well, you know, this is my reaction. I'm a developmental psychologist, and I thought, I don't believe it. It doesn't make any sense to me. I don't believe it. I've spent lots of time talking to kids, even as a graduate student, and it just didn't make any sense to me. So I thought, well, okay, I got to do something about it. What his corpus was is he asked adults to describe a time when their life was in danger. So you can imagine this high point, you know, the analysis, they're talking about they thought they were going to die. There's a lot of evaluation, a lot of emotion, and you can believe these were well-structured narratives. But what was he asking kids? To describe television shows or describe movies. Now, come on. Let's get real here. So reading this, essentially inspired the next couple of decades of research of mine. I decided, I've got to go, I've got to work in this area, and I've got to study children, which, you know, no one had yet done with narrative analysis. So the first thing I did after getting my, you know, doctorate and I could start doing research on my own is I did this large study on children's narratives across a wide age range. And what that involved is individually interviewing children one-on-one about their life adventures. So what we would do is we would ask children between 3.5 and 9.5 years of age to talk about all sorts of personally significant events. And we had, you know, a list of kind of prompts to get them started. But, you know, these particular children that we worked with, they were all working class in a community near Cleveland. I happened to be at Oberlin College at the time. So these were the samples of children that we could get access to. And as I said, we individually interviewed them. We asked them about, you know, times like, you know, visits to the park, or times, various vacations or holidays that they'd been on, playing with friends, things like, you know, various things related to seasonal stuff, like, you know, sledding. This one is sledding off a roof. Other things that happen in you know, exciting adventures that happen at home, or adventures with pets, things that happen with pets, you know, when things happen to them, or even mundane things, you know, whatever they want to tell us about. That's what we said, okay, tell us a story. So what we were doing is we were trying to get them to tell us narratives, adventures of their lives about, you know, we gave them lots of opportunities, lots of cues about, you know, what about holidays, what about pets, what about, etc. But as a consequence, we gathered a corpus of, you know, of hundreds and hundreds of narratives from these children. And then what we did is we said, okay, Leboff has what he calls this classic narrative style. Okay, I need to stand by a graph here for this. Leboff had this classic narrative style, and what we did is my research collaborator and I, a former student, we kind of took all the children's stories and we kind of made piles of what made sense in terms of structure. And we developed a series of different structural categories for the children. And one of the categories is impoverished. Now, what you're talking about here over time is children's age between 4 years of age and 9 years of age. So these are the various marks: 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Okay? And the impoverished narratives were very, very short, or they were very confused. And so those are the ones that we had. This is a percentage of narratives. You'll notice that the 4-year-olds, yeah, they had some and they disappeared. Then we looked at another category. We looked at is something that Leboff, you know, talked about with these young children, which is leapfrog, where they kind of would leap from, you know, one event to another event, and you'd think, okay, they're obviously connected somehow. I wonder how they're connected. But they obviously are all part of the same category. But you notice again, they are disappearing over time. And then chronological. This is the one that Leboff characterized kids having the most, which is this happened, and this happened, and this happened, and this happened, and this happened. There's no high point, there's no central structure. And, you know, and we found that at all ages, you know, these persisted. But then now let's look at the kind of ones that are structured the way Leboff says. And this end at the high point is where the children, in fact, were giving you this beginning part. They were giving you the orientation. They were giving you the complicating action. They were taking you up to the high point, crisis point, and they were giving you lots of evaluation and then forgetting to end it all. And you're kind of like left there suspended and like, what happened? Now, our role as interviewers was not to give them cues, not to tell them what to say. We would just say, yeah, right, okay. And so we're kind of left there going, and then what? Okay, but you notice that these, you know, that this was the most common structure with children who were 5, and then they disappeared. And here is the classic structure that Leboff talked about. Notice that they were very uncommon with these 3.5 to 4.5 7-year-olds, but notice what happens. And by the time these children get to be, 7, 8, 9, that's the predominant thing they're doing. They're doing exactly what it is that Leboeuf said no one, under 15 years of age can do, that they're giving us this classic structure. Okay? So obviously, the first thing that shows is that kids can do this too if you ask them to talk about the right kinds of things, if you ask them to talk about things that they care about, that they're interested in. Well, I thought the next step, by this time I'd moved to Newfoundland, and the prior research that had been done, it began when children were 3.5 years of age, and it was all cross-sectional with different children. So what we wanted to do here is use the same children and follow them over time longitudinally so that we could trace in each child what exactly was happening in terms of their development. So this research was longitudinal. We began, since children already had a lot of skills at 3.5 years of age, we began right when they were barely 2 years old. And then what we did is we visited them every single month. We had a graduate student and I would, between us, we visited the children every single month and we interviewed them. We did that until the children were 3.5 years of age, and then after that I visited them every 6 months up until they were 5 years of age. Okay, and what we found, well, there's all sorts of interesting things we found that, in fact, the linguistics people have been interested in. We traced how they used connectives to connect, different parts of sentences, how they started using causal connection, temporal connection, then, and, but, so, etc. And that was very interesting, how they learned the language of making, their narratives cohesive. But what really, really amazed us is absolutely amazing. The individual differences between children just, completely blew us away. And I'm going to illustrate that with two of the narratives that we gathered from children. Before I give you the narratives, I'd like to give you the background. These children both are exactly 3 or 6 months of age. Both of these children are, they are from two-parent families, and both of their parents had graduated from Memorial University. On all the assessments that we gave of the children, they're in terms of language skills, basic IQ, those kinds of things. All those assessments, they were very similar to each other. They were within half standard deviation. So they were very close. So you can't look and say, oh, well, these are different socioeconomic status kids, these are, et cetera. No, these children, in terms of those major characteristics, those children were very, very similar. Now let's look at these. Let's look at these narratives. Okay, first narrative, fishing. Have you ever caught a fish? Yes. Oh, you did? It was a great big one, and I lifted him off, and I lifted him up in the boat. And I said, and you lifted him off, and you lifted him up in the boat? Yes. And I lift him at the boat. You lift him in the boat? Yes. Lift him at the boat. Yeah, I lift him in the boat. Yeah, and he's a great big one. And he's a yuck one. He's a yuck one? Yes, and I sawed him. Purple. Okay. Well, what do you know in this entire narrative? What you know is the fact that he lifted the fish into the boat and that the fish was purple. And that's all you know. Now compare this with another child. Remember, same background, same exact age. Okay? Have you ever gotten stung by a bee? But Mark, and it happens to be your brother, got a big sting when he was first born. What really means is when he was much younger. Okay? Mark had a big sting when he was first born. Yeah, well, tell me about it. What happened? I was walking with him, and he falled, and he didn't know what he falled, right on a bee. And his knee was on a bee and stung. He got stung on a bee. He got stung on a bee? And then I was walking another baby, Randy, and you know what? What? I heard him, and me and Randy came running, and you know what? What? Paul Smith came too. Paul Smith came too. I tried to pick him up, but he didn't want me to, but I had to call my mommy. You had to call your mommy, My daddy and everybody who I knowed who was a grown-up, and then everybody who I knowed and who was a grown-up came. They all came, from my house. And I was walking in the park. They came over after Mark, and they wanted to see what happened to Mark. Wanted to see what happened to Mark, And then I told him, and I looked down at his knee, and there it was, stung. And there it was, stung. Looked at his knee, there it was, stung, And I tried to pick him up, and he wanted me to pick him up right at that minute. What don't you know? You know who, where, when, what, why. There's nothing you don't know. This child is barely 3 years, 6 months old. Okay? This is a well-structured classic narrative in Leboff's term. There's no doubt that narrative fits all those characteristics. So the question we had to ask is, why are we getting these kind of individual differences? And this is why we believe we got them. This is conversation that's happening between a parent and a child. Parents, parents, parents. We asked parents to, not only did we come and interview the child, but we also asked parents to tape record their memory conversations with their child monthly, or if some of them didn't get to it monthly, so bi-monthly or every 2 months or 3 months or so on. And what we found is that the child's narrative skill matched the parent's narrative style. The children that had the advanced narrative skills had parents who did a certain number of things. First of all, they talked about the past a lot. They used a very elaborative style when they were talking about with the child, and then you looked at what the child was doing, and it was very much patterned on what the parents were doing. Now, the problem, of course, is this research is all correlational. We looked at the children who had good narrative skills, and we found that the parents also had this elaborative way of talking to them, but correlational research, you can't say anything about causation. My favorite example, of course, is that the amount that you know is as highly and positively correlated with the length of your big toe, and that is true. It is true, okay? Babies don't know a lot, and they have very tiny big toes. As they grow, they learn more, and their big toe gets bigger, right? So, it has nothing, how much they know and the length of their big toe really aren't directly related. They really are both related to something else, which is a child getting older. So this may be going on here. I mean, we don't know. So what we had to do is we had to do experimental research, and we did that, and we wanted to know, do these parent differences in how they're talking to their child actually cause differences in the child's narrative skills? So this experimental study, what we did is we took low-income parents because they were less likely to use this kind of elaborative style that we're talking about. It's not that that none of them do, but they are less likely to do so. And we randomly assigned them to either intervention or control groups. And the intervention ones, what happened with them is we taught them the principles of narrative elaboration style. These are the things that the parents did who had children with very, very good narrative skills. What are those things? Well, first of all, they found time regularly to talk to their child about their child's past experiences. And they did that. They talked about the past a lot. They talked about what happened this morning, what happened yesterday, what happened last weekend, what happened last month when we visited Grandma. Remember last Christmas when such and such happened? Remember last our holiday? They talked about the past, and they did it frequently. And when they did that, they also talked about everything they talked about a long time. They didn't just give, remember when we went to Grandma's and you climbed the tree? That was fun, wasn't it? The end of narrative. No. They talked about it for a very, very long time. And they also, when they were doing it, they helped the child build the story by encouraging the child to talk about beginnings, middles, ends, to talk about the various parts of a story. In addition, they asked lots and lots of WH questions: who, where, when, and so on. So they were trying to use those WH questions, not yes, no questions, because what does a child say? That doesn't get them to do much. And they also, we taught them that you had to listen very carefully to what it is that the child is saying and essentially encourage them, be enthusiastic. follow the child's lead. Whatever the child wants to talk about, the things that they're interested in talking about, that's what you talk about. And when you're in the middle of these conversations, elaborate on what the child says. So if the child talks about, about this particular toy, then you elaborate on even more how, so you can turn the lever and the child elaborates. That what you've got here is, each of them elaborating on what the other person does. And those things, other research since that time, not only by myself, but by other labs have found those things really make a difference in terms of children acquiring narrative skills. Okay? So the conclusions we had from this research was that parent listening style, yep, we can talk about causation, we can talk about cause and effect, because these parents that had in the intervention, when they learned it, their kids had enormous improvement in narrative skills, and the kids in the control parents did not. So we also have demonstrated that parents can be shown ways of being elaborative, ways that they can successfully do that. And furthermore, that teaching good narrative skills has other kinds of gains for children, and the most important gain it is in terms of literacy acquisition. And in fact, one of the bodies of research shows that the child's narrative skills when they enter kindergarten is a good predictor for their literacy, how readily they learn to read, and their literacy acquisition later on. Not being able to figure out what an A sounds like and how a B looks, but when they get to comprehension. Because what those personal narratives are, the structure of them, is the same structure as those stories that they're reading about in their readers. And so the child already has that structure in mind when they start using readers. So this, a number of programs have been developed in various places that use these principles that are used in community centers and schools, et cetera. And, the advantage of this oral-based one is that the parents themselves don't have to be very literate in order to be able to do it, because this program is based on oral skills, and everybody can do that. You don't have to be highly literate in terms of parents. You don't have to have lots of books in the house in order to be able to still be able to help your child learn these pre-literacy skills. Okay, well, at this point, we had serendipity happen again. I read a particular article by Gail Goodman that in 1991, and her focus was on this crucial issue of children as eyewitnesses. And the state of affairs at the time is that, well, children really were not believed a whole lot. They didn't appear in court a lot. They were not seen as credible witnesses. There was a lot of concern about children just can't tell the difference between fantasy and reality, and besides which they have lousy memories, and how can they make good witnesses in court when you've got these kind of problems? And most of the research that was done on children's memory at that time was done in a laboratory, and that means it had to be mundane events. So children weren't very good at remembering that a particular clown who was there had purple striped pants instead of green striped pants, and they weren't very good at remembering that on their hat they had a star instead of something else. So what her study did, it was a very groundbreaking study. What she did is she says, okay, we got to go into real life situations where there's potentially a stressful event. And what she chose is 4 to 5-year-olds who were giving a well child checkup, who were at the doctor's, and as part of that, they not only got a checkup, but they also got their needles or inoculations for their for various illnesses, diseases, and so on. And it was true that some of the children cried, but for the most part, most of the children were not very upset. But notice, this event is still enormously controlled. And the children also, it was real life ones in the environment, but the children still did not show very good memory. It was pretty lousy. And I said, wait a minute, wait. I don't believe this either. Now, I've been listening to kids tell me narratives, personal narratives, for a long time, okay? And they certainly can produce good narratives. But one of the things we often, at the beginning, we asked kids about is when they went to doctors for checkups, and we found they told us lousy narratives about those because they didn't care, they weren't interesting. Okay? What were the longest and best narratives about? Blood, guts, and gore. That's what they like to talk about more than anything else. If they had had a personal injury, we got the longest and best narratives from the kids about those. So I thought, okay. I wasn't a memory researcher. I'd never done memory research, really. I was looking at the structure of narratives, and really, I didn't care whether what the kids were telling me was accurate or not. I wasn't interested in their memory. I was just looking at how they structured it. But I thought, okay, maybe I have the background to approach this problem from a different perspective, being a narrative researcher, okay? What I need to do is I need to change from a narrative researcher, I need to become a memory researcher. So what we need to investigate, we have to investigate real life events that are stressful, that have ecological validity. After all, those are the kinds of things that put a child into the court system. Okay? Not things like, these mundane kind of things that happen in a laboratory. You got to get real important, stressful life events. And you can't do that in a lab because you can't deliberately cause that kind of stress to a young child. You just can't do that. You wouldn't want to, and obviously ethically, you wouldn't be allowed to. So I thought, okay, I've got to find a real-life stressful event, and I also have to find some way of evaluating the report quality and the accuracy. After all, I'm not doing it in a controlled situation in the lab. How can I do that? What can I do? At which case, this occurred to me. This is my son at age 3.5. He broke his arm. Okay? And he told me afterwards, believe me, that smile was not what happened when when it happened. And he, at one point, described to me later on that what happened when he was in the hospital having his arm fixed, he said he screamed so loudly that his teddy bear in the car out in the parking lot could hear him. And if teddy bears had ears, that's exactly the case. He was really, really distressed. I thought, okay, I think I've got an event. And that started 2 decades of emergency room research, where my students camped out in the emergency room 7 days a week, a minimum of 8 hours a day. We aimed for 12 if we could do it. They were there in the emergency room, and when injured children came in, we went to the parents and talked to them and talked to the child and tried to recruit them to our study. Interestingly, about 80% of parents agreed to participate in our research. And the nursing staff there, the triage nurse, was very, very helpful in all this as well. So, our students just sat there and sat there and sat there endlessly. And as I said, a virtual army is what it took in order to do that. And the Canadian government has a lot of programs for undergraduates to work part-time as research assistants. These are, the USEP and SWAS programs. And Memorial University was very generous in providing me with a lot of these people so that we actually could be in the emergency room. What we had to do in order to keep these people in our sample is we had to go to their houses. And that their houses, our rule was if they lived within an hour's drive of St. John's, that's where we would go. So we went to locations that were rural. We went to places that were in the city. We went directly to their houses and interviewed. We had to establish rapport with the child. We interviewed the child, often gave various assessment instruments to the child as well when we were doing it. And at the same time, we interviewed their parents. And if their parents had not witnessed it, we interviewed whatever eyewitnesses there were that were adult eyewitnesses. So we interviewed the grandparents or the babysitters or the preschool teachers or the teachers or the, whoever were the witnesses of the event. So that's what we did. As I said, it took not only a huge army of people in the emergency room camping out, but to do all the interviewing and then do all the transcription of all of those interviews, not to mention when you get to the scoring and you get to the data. Okay, first of all, there was huge variation in child distress. Some of those children were incredibly distressed. Their parents said they had never, ever seen them that distressed. They were just, you know, completely hysterical. They were white, shaking, and so on. And other kids, much less distressed. So we had variation. Other children said, yeah, it hurt, but, you know, it wasn't so bad. We also had variation in terms of what happened to the kids, because remember, we weren't controlling it. Now, our two biggest categories were children who had lacerated themselves and had to be stitched up, or children who broke bones. And they broke, you know, collarbones and, you know, arms and legs and et cetera, et cetera. But those are the two biggest categories. But we had a lot of other categories, too. Some children burned themselves. One particular child, remember, the part of the power motor, his father told him don't touch it because it's hot, and he went over immediately and touched it because he wanted to see if his dad was telling the truth, whether it really was. As fingers getting squished indoors and those power windows. Probably the most unusual one is a 5-year-old child who had a wasp fly up her nose and kept singing and stinging and stinging and stinging until it was forceps out at the emergency room. She naturally was in hysterics the whole time. So we had a wide variation of, I know, poor kid. We had a wide variation in terms of what happened to the children. And then we interviewed the adult eyewitnesses, and we compared what the child said with what the adult said. We had no choice but to use what the adult said as the gold standard against which we could compare what the child said. And so that's what we did. It's true there may be an occasional adult error in there, but you know, we have no choice. When you're not in the laboratory, when you're dealing with things in the real world, that's what you got to, those kind of compromises you have to deal with. So the type of injury made no difference, whether they broke arms or whatever. Now let's look at what we found. And to be honest, I was truly amazed at what we surprised. Let's look at accuracy. Over time, yes, accuracy deteriorates, and we interview children not only initially, but various children in various studies. They would be other long-term follow-up of 1 year, 2 years. Our longest one was children who were re-interviewed after 5 years, okay? So here's their memory. For the 7 up, all the way up to 13 years of age, when they were initially interviewed, their accuracy was 95%, and after 5 years, it went down to 90. Like, excuse me, wow, I was truly amazed. What about younger children? Okay, let's look at 5 to 6-year-olds. 5 to 6-year-olds, it also started off at 95% right afterwards, and it went down to, well, 85% after 5 years. That's still pretty good. What about 3 and 4-year-olds? These are really young kids. 95 went down to 75. 2-year-olds. 5 years is virtually their entire life. And they still were 75% accurate after 5 years. That really did surprise me. Wow, that accuracy was truly, truly awesome. Now let's look at other kinds of scoring, like completeness. What we did is we looked at each event really fit a prototype, like the child was a particular location, something happened to them, it may or may not have been caused by a person, but then someone was the first person to get to them, that person did something, and so on. So there was, these prototypical events of who was there, where they were, and so on. So we scored the completeness of their memory. This allows assessment of the child's memory for the overall event, for how all the components of the overall event. That's what that allows, okay? And what we found after 5 years, no change. They didn't forget any of those components. 5 years, remember, all those ages of the kids. Wow, that was a big surprise too. And, they clearly were not deteriorating there. So now let's look at information detail. These are the little tiny details. We counted information that was new information, unique information. So if you compare, for example, these two right here, I was at my nan's versus I was in my nan's backyard down by the fence where there's a hole near the river. This one was provided initially by the child. 5 years later, the child provided this. They both, in terms of the prototypes, they're both equivalent because they both say where it happened. But notice all the extra information that we're getting 5 years later. Okay? And what we found is that children of all ages were in fact providing us more information, and most of it accurate over time, but that's because by now they had better vocabularies, they had better understanding of what I expected as an interviewer. You know, we wanted more detail. They were more conversant, they were more cooperative interview subjects, all those kinds of things. So they were providing us with more information, not less. So, and as I said, most of it was correct. So what does this mean? Well, wow, these kids are doing a whole lot better than I ever anticipated. So let's look at other kinds of factors. Remember, some of those kids were incredibly distressed and other kids not so distressed. What does stress have to do with? It was, again, really surprising. Little or no relationship with accuracy, with the completeness of injury recall, or with the amount of detail. Now, that's really surprising because for adults, high stress really, really compromises their recall. I mean, their recall gets a whole lot worse. And it's hard to imagine these kids screaming and crying so hard and yet they're remembering. But, you know, it had very little impact. That surprised us as well, okay? So what does research mean? First and foremost, most importantly, children can be good witnesses. We were finding that even down to age 2. They can be good witnesses, forensic witnesses. Yes, they can, you know, they're not mixing up fantasy and reality. By the way, we found no instances of that. They can... Now, historically, they've been treated with enormous amount of suspicion. They thought, oh, they just can't remember. They have no memory skills, et cetera, et cetera. They, you know, yeah, but, you know, often not even allowed to be witnesses. But this research and that of, you know, other people has clearly shown that children can, in fact, be good witnesses and has had enormous impact on the courts. I'm the only person so far that has used children in injuries in emergency rooms. But other research that has looked at other kind of medical events or children's memory of destructive hurricane that destroys their houses, they're all finding the same kind of thing. And so as a consequence of this body of research, children really are being given a voice in court, like they've never had before. They are in court at lots of different, much, much younger than they've ever been. And in fact, here in Canada, the judge cannot even warn a jury to treat what they say with a grain of salt or caution because, you know, there's no reason to have done. The data clearly shows that they are able. Now, it is true that children are vulnerable to misleading and coercive questioning. They are more vulnerable than adults are to bad questioning, but that's not a problem with their memory. That's a problem with us and how we interview them. And here we have another piece of serendipity, okay? I read another research article that really caught my interest. This is on childhood amnesia. And childhood amnesia is the absence or scarcity of memories about one's very, very earliest years. And data on this from adults shows that when you think about your very, very earliest memory, you know, you can't remember the very earliest. Some people remember maybe to when they're 2, 3, okay, you know, and then by the time they get to be 7, you know, then they've got lots of memory for things that happen to them. And if you look at the data within North America, the average age of people's first memory, if you ask them, what's the very, very first memory you can recall? What's the very first one? Well, there's a lot of variation between people, but on average is age 3.5. That's the average, but again, a lot of variation between people. So why did it pique my interest? Well, first of all, it was an intriguing phenomenon, but almost, here we go again, I'm a developmentalist, remember? Almost all this research is done on adults, virtually none on kids. And what really caught my attention is the explanations. Why are kids not able to to remember, why are people not able to remember their very early years? Because the inability of children that young to form verbal long-term memories. The reason that you can't remember back to when you were 3 and 2 years of age is because you didn't have the cognitive system that allowed you to form memories at that time. Well, what have I been doing with my eyewitness memory research and my narrative research but showing that, yes, kids can form memories. This can't be the explanation. It can't be. So I thought, okay, I got to start learning about this I don't believe it response again. Now, anecdotally from parents, that's not to say that childhood amnesia doesn't exist, because anecdotal reports from parents show that it does. Let me give you an example with my own son. When he was 20 months old, we visited Greece, and he loved what he called the donkeys, right? Whenever we saw a donkey, we had to go over and pet it and talk to it, and we talked about donkeys endlessly, not only on that trip, but probably for months after we got back. Okay? When I interviewed him as part of this study and asked him what were his earliest memories, he had no memory of those donkeys, which really, really surprised me. What did he remember as his first memory? It was from 22 months of age. The house that we currently have, when we visited it for the first time, this, bushy, bright-eyed, blonde-haired, blue-eyed kid who has not a molecule of shyness in his whole body, he sat talking to the wife of the couple who owned it, and she fed him chocolate chip cookies, and off they stayed by themselves. Meanwhile, my husband and I were shown around the property, the house, and everything else by the husband, okay? And after we bought the house, we, first of all, that room was renovated, so walls were taken down, everything was changed. He never saw that woman again. He never saw her furniture again. He never saw any of those things. And yet he has very, very detailed memory of that as his first memory. And we certainly never talked about it. So here is, that one that I would have expected to stay left. So clearly an instance of childhood amnesia. So my students and I did the first large-scale systematic study of childhood amnesia in children. We took children between 6 and 16 years of age, and we asked them for their 3 earliest memories. And of course, kids were asked for how old they were at the time of each of those memories, but naturally we asked the parents as well. We asked the parents for verification that the event actually happened and what age the child was when those things happened. An age of earliest memory, what we found is that for the children who were younger, their age of earliest memory was, from a younger time. And as the child was older, when we were talking to 10 to 13 years of age, their age of earliest memory was later, and 14 to 16-year-olds later again. So what that's suggesting is that, the memories that the younger children had seem to be disappearing. And that somehow they're fragile, and, the older children simply can't remember as far back. But remember, cross-sectional research, childhood amnesia obviously is in children as well as adults, and the age of children's earliest memory is going up, but we need to study children longitudinally, not cross-sectionally. We need to take the same children and follow them over time, okay? That way we can trace it in the kids. So that's what we did. Did a 2-year follow-up study, and we wanted to know, did the children have the same memories? And if they didn't have the same memory, did they still, if they didn't provide them when we asked for the 3 earliest memories, if we gave them clues, could they come up with them if they were prompted? Now, they couldn't just say, yes, I remember it. They had to tell us a whole lot more about it. They had to give us a lot of detail about it. Now, as a control, we also prompted them for fake memories, for things that did not happen. And they virtually always said, no, that never happened to me. But some of the memories that they had told us about 2 years earlier, 2 years later, they said, no, that never happened. No, no, didn't happen to me. No. They had forgotten them, Okay, so what we found is some memories were kept, but some were indeed lost. And loss was related to the age of the child at the time of the experience. So younger children were much more likely to lose a lot more of those memories. And with an increasing age, there was more consistency, so that by the time they got to be, 10 years of age, they seemed to have this consolidated little pile of, these are my earliest memories. And then those memories stayed with them over time. So 2 years later, yep, same memory. Okay. Now, why did some go and why did some stay? I should mention that this particular study, this longitudinal study, resulted in an amazing media frenzy. Obviously, a lot of people are interested in childhood amnesia because we got called by media resources all over the world about this memory. In fact, when we put in this research and my name into Google at that time, a couple months later, it was over 5 million hits on it. I mean, it was being talked about all over the world in various things. So it clearly had a lot of interest. A lot of people really are interested in this phenomenon. But the biggest question that I was asked over and over again by people who were interviewing me is, why did some go and some stay? What is it about the memories that stay? What is it that is happening? So we thought, we haven't looked at that yet, but it's time to do that. And what we did is some memories disappear. Yeah, that's true. But why do some stay? And we found, of course, if they were older at the time, that was one of the things that led to it. But more interestingly, if the event was emotional, either positive or negative, it was 3 times more likely to stay. And not only if the event was emotional, but totally independent of that, if it was coherent. If the memory report when they were at an earlier age was a coherent one where they gave us essentially a good narrative, then that was 5 times more likely to stay. So coherent memories, emotional memories, that's what made those memories stick. Okay? And if they didn't have that, they're more likely to be lost. So at that point, I encountered a research study by someone that works with Chinese children, and I thought, oh, geez, I contacted her and said, you're interested in doing some of this cross-cultural research? She said, sure. So we were able to do a comparison of Canadian children here in Newfoundland versus Chinese children from Beijing. And what we did is we looked at childhood amnesia. We did the same thing of asking, what are their earliest memories? But in addition, we did something called a memory fluency test, where what we did is we asked for as many memories as they could think of in 4 minutes. And those memories had to be from before they started school. Okay? So we gave them 4 minutes. We were going to write down. Don't tell us a lot about each memory. Just keep going, as many memories as you can. What we were looking at is how accessible are memories from these very early years. That's what we were looking at. We compared 8, 11, and 14-year-olds, and I'd like to give you some data on, first of all, the number of memories that they came up in the memory fluency task. For adults, when you give them this task, they give you, in North America and in Western Europe, they give you about 9 memories in this 4 minutes, and that's in fact what our 11 and 14-year-olds were doing. They were giving us, these are the Canadian children, 11 and 14, they were giving you about the same as what adults do. And if you look at the 6-year-olds, they were having or the children who were 8 years of age, they were having a little more difficulty staying on task. They weren't coming up with as much. But what really is interesting is you look at the Chinese children. Now, they start school a whole year later, which means they had a whole extra year from which to withdraw memories, and that year was closer to their current age. And yet, they had a lot fewer memories. They couldn't remember what happened very much from before they started school. And then we looked at their earliest memory, their very earliest memory. These are the Canadian children. Their very earliest memory was back, when they were quite young, 2.5 and so years of age. These are the children who are from China, and their earliest memory consistently at all those ages was more than a year later. Now, my colleague from China, she she thinks the reason that this happens is that in North America, we emphasize individuality, and so we're always talking to children about their adventures and what they've done and all their experiences, whereas in China, that's not appropriate. You want to tie the child into the group, into communities, and so it's not seen as appropriate to emphasize themselves that way. And in fact, if you look at the content of the Chinese children, the majority of the content was we, my group, my family did things. Whereas if you look at the content of the Canadian children, it was I, and I. Okay, so conclusions. What we have found in that and other research is that lots of things influence how much and how early you remember, that's for sure. Culture certainly does, but also parent-child relationships. That if they have, we found with adults, men in particular, if they have warm relationships with their fathers, they remember more of their early childhood. They have earlier memories. Okay, and parent reminiscing style, if they do those kinds of things I'm talking about in terms of elaboration, they seem to have earlier memories. Birth order, probably because for firstborn kids, you have more time to talk to that child and more time to reminisce, okay? And I'm sure there's other factors. So let me sum up this whole body of research. First of all, this research clearly was curiosity, or as one of my colleagues says, intellectually driven research. Lots of agencies and lots of governments feel that you get the most bang for the buck if they fund directed research rather than basic research. If they tell you, we want you to look at this. Very often, they want to direct it toward economically important goals, okay? Now overall, over and over and over again, repeatedly it's been shown that basic research has a better long-term track record than targeted research. But governments and agencies often just don't believe that. If you look at my particular research, if my funding had been subject to targeting, it would never have been done. It simply would not. I could not predict, when I began, a priori, what I was going to find. I could not predict where I was going to go. And it certainly doesn't have direct economic impact, but it has a lot of social impact. Okay. So I think I'd like to finish with this notion that scientists really do need to be able to have this flexibility. They really need to be able to not only engage in basic research, but to be able to go where their interest is and go in new directions when it's appropriate. And I've been very grateful that the research that I've had from INSERC primarily has allowed me to do that. Now, acknowledgements, as I said, a huge number of students have been involved in this. And I've also had a number of other collaborators, including Alyssa McCabe, Beulah Jesso, Robin Fivish, Chi Wang, Yubo Hu, Lynn Baker Ward, Gwen Morris, Andrew Smorty, Frank Catani, all these people at various, at other institutions and other universities. INSERC and the ClearNet, the Canadian Language and Literacy Research Network, have been great. And also, I'd like to emphasize the long-term research assistant Penny Vautier, who has been enormously important in this research being done. Having that kind of consistency has been, this is Penny right here. She's been really good. And also, I'd like to thank my husband, Michael Bruce Locker. He's an engineering professor, and he's been lifelong help in terms of technical support, and he's right there. And he's really been very helpful for that. And I have had enormous, all of my department heads that I've been under have been enormously supportive. And the university, the Dean of Science's office has also been very supportive. So I will leave you there. Back with the gonkies. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Carole. I think we have time for questions. Well, let me ask, sorry, John?
You go first.
Let me ask you one quick question.
Yeah.
One thing I was wondering is when you're doing your cross-cultural studies and you're taking a look at memory retention, have you ever looked at oral versus literate societies?
No, I haven't. Actually, the only cross-cultural research that we've done so far is with children, has been China and Canada. In terms of adults, we've looked at Italian versus but Canadian. But I have a collaborator now in Iran, and we're going to get an opportunity to look at Iranian children. But again, that's not literate versus non-literate. No, I have never looked at it. Yeah. John, you
I was going to ask you about the studies where you trained adults how to give proper narratives to their children, and then subsequently tested them. Could that, or was that done in a double-blind fashion, like a medical experiment was?
Well, what we certainly did is that individuals were randomly assigned to those two groups, okay? And obviously the people who were doing the intervention, they were not the ones who did the assessment later on, okay? So what we had is other people went in and assessed the children, not only right after, but more importantly, we assessed them a year later and 2 years later. And where the real gains appeared was like a year later and 2 years later. That's where the real gains were, because it takes time for the change in the parent's behavior to get translated into the child. And so, yeah, what we did is we had different people who, didn't know anything about what the groups were. They were the ones who were doing the interviewing later on, and then you were just coding data in terms of, vocabulary and so on. Yeah.
One thing we found in our family is when we've been discussing early memories in early life of either ourselves or our children, we've occasionally said, well, I know that happened because we have a photograph of it. But then if we probe it more deeply, it turns out that what we're remembering is the photograph.
Yeah, and that's the question. You ask whether or not what they're really remembering is a photograph instead. And in fact, that has been looked at in some studies, including one of the studies that we have. And what we found is for the real young memories, no, the photographs are not helping at all. In fact, they may make it worse. But when you get to memories from later on, the photographs often become important. But we were finding that no, it's not. The photograph, whether there was a photograph or not only wasn't important, but other people found that if there was a photograph on some early events, the children weren't remembering them as well. All they were remembering is just the photograph and nothing else. Okay. Whereas when there wasn't a photograph, they were remembering about the event. Yeah.
I had a question for you. I was wondering if you had any opportunity.
I'm sorry, what?
Or if you had crossed paths with the concept of dissociative amnesia, the idea that a trauma, such as sexual abuse or the homicide of a parent or anything of that significance could create an amnesia in a child that would affect their memory of those events. So we looked at stressful events, or you looked at stressful events, but a stressful event that's abnormal, that's off the charts. Broken bones would be, a stressful event, but childhood sexual abuse or, like I said, the death of. The traumatic death of a parent or something like that. The memory wars of the 90s concentrated a lot on whether there was forensic value in recovered memories of childhood sexual abuse. And I was just wondering if you had an opinion on that, or if your research ever crossed paths with that concept.
Okay, well, first of all, we did not deal with children who had those kinds of stressful events. If the triage nurse, when we were dealing in the hospital, if they suspected there was possible abuse, they kind of directed us away from those families. So they did not want us to interact with any families that might potentially end up in court. And so we did not deal with any children like that. In terms of memory, it certainly is the case. A lot of research has cast a lot of suspicion on if memories were forgotten and then retrieved at a later memory, and suddenly, oh, now I remember. I didn't remember ever before. This is the first time there certainly is, we know that it's very easy to implant memories, and so there's a lot of suspicion that is directed toward those memories, particularly if they're retrieved by use of hypnosis or something like that. But in terms of a child who has that kind of traumatic event, their memory, Lenore Terr has done some work with that, and she's finding that for those kids, if they're older than 2.5 years of age, she's finding that they have good memory of those events continuously, okay? But if they're under 2.5 years of age, then in fact they're not remembering it. They have implicit memory, but they don't have explicit memory. We found the same thing because we interviewed children. We recruited children into our study at the age of when they were only 1 to 2 years of age. Obviously, we couldn't interview them. They were not able to be interviewed, but we interviewed all the adult eyewitnesses. And when they did acquire the appropriate memory skills a year later, 6 months later, a year later, a year and a half later, and we interviewed them, and sometimes 5 years after their injury, we found that if their injury happened when they were under 2 years of age or just a little barely over 2, they usually could not remember it, and if they did remember it, they remembered pieces, and it would not be forensically useful because they'd had a piece of this and then a piece of some other kind of event and a piece of this other event, and they'd amalgamate them into one kind of story, and you just, there's no way you could find out. I mean, it just didn't match up, except little pieces here and there with reality. So children who were under 2 years of age, they were not, even if they could give you something, usually they said, no, I don't remember. But if they did give you something, they weren't giving you anything that was forensically useful because they were just taking pieces and, you know, sticking them all together. Whereas when children were 2.5 and on up, they didn't do that. Okay? So that makes me think that if you're dealing with someone who had an event like that happen when they were under 2 years of age, then yeah, with kids that age, yeah, I'd have a lot of concern about the accuracy of what they're saying. Okay? Yeah.
That's all right, I'll talk loud. Okay. I'm wondering about the level of detail that is provided to memories. So you had an example about something happened to a child, and I was at my nan's. And then you asked them later, and I was at my nan's in the backyard, and there's a hole down by the river. So how can you determine, if at all, if that new information is a result of the original memory, or if it's something that I just remember now from my nan's place?
Yeah. Well, that's a good question, and it's hard to say. But what we found is consistently, when the children, you know, even if when we went back and interviewed them like 5 years later, the parents would say things like, oh, they're not going to remember it, that's old history. I mean, we haven't talked about that for years, and yet the kids had these incredible memory of it. I think what's really going on is that they are so much older, they understand the interview game. Okay, and I think they understand. I think that they knew all that information before, but they didn't understand that that's what you do when you interview. You provide lots of information. We know that children, as they get older, they understand more and more about what this interviewer process is all about, and that what it is that you want us to do. Okay, when we interviewed some children that we older children, we didn't interview them till the very, very first time, like a year after it happened. We, of course, interviewed all the witnesses right away. And we found, you know, they hadn't been interviewed beforehand, and they still had a lot of that information. But I think it's just, particularly the younger kids, as they get older, they're more cooperative. That's particularly the case for 2-year-olds. If you've ever tried to interview a 2-year-old, we had handheld tape recorders, and you'd be running around after them as they were doing, you know, and then you'd bounce on the bed and you this. They don't stay still to be interviewed. They're not into that. They're just much, much too busy doing other kinds of things. Okay, and that's very much the case. Also, slightly less the case for 3-year-olds, but you know, they're just not cooperating when it comes to interviewing. So I think what we're talking about here is that knowledge is there, but it's just they don't have the right, they don't not only have the right words, but they also don't understand that's part of the process.
We'll take one more question, then I think we'll retire to a reception. Bill?
Carole, I was just intrigued about children in court and getting information from them. So, how would you do that? Because when I think about court and proceedings, I never think that people actually want information as much as they want to manipulate information. So wouldn't you have to change the process to get real information?
That's, in fact, a lot of people are looking at that issue, how you might be able to change the process so that children are not, I mean, a lot of them are coerced and I mean, they're horrendously treated in court. The problem is, one of the things that in some places they're doing is having the child, instead of having to stay, you know, sit and directly look into the eyes of the person that they're accusing right in front of them, they're having the child being interviewed in another room, with it being live video feed into the courtroom and to the jury, so that they don't have to do that. The problem is then if the child doesn't get totally upset and fall to pieces, then juries are less likely to believe them. You know, so you put the child through enormous trauma in the court system in order to have the jury believe that this really happened. This is a real problem in how to interview children so you get the most appropriate information and that you don't traumatize the child by that process. And it's a tough problem. It really is. And we don't have any solutions yet.
Okay, I hate to cut it off, but that's always symptomatic of a great presentation when there's more questions than we have time. But you're going to have an opportunity to ask any additional questions at a reception, which is being hosted after this presentation just outside the doors here. But first of all, I would like to thank the Royal Society for putting on this presentation. It's fantastic. The very first one is taking place at Memorial University. Small token of our thanks for this